RadioNext.tv on the Cool Groove site. It is 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on a beautiful Wednesday morning here in Indianapolis, Indiana. And we are making our second run on the Comenius Institute Warp and Woof Radio Show. Dr. Mark Eckel, Harold H.B. Bell in the house right now. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Eckel. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing real well.
Excellent response to last week's show.
Great.
Very informative, and I think today we have a show that's really going to be powerful for our listeners. Go ahead, and if you want to take this thing right now and run with it before we get into the meat of it.
All right. Well, we want to talk about education today. That's our general theme, and about how God is going to communicate His truth to the next generation. But just overall, let me kind of walk us back through how we go about thinking through this particular program. We want to highlight the tagline for Comenius, which is where wisdom and life connect. And so each of the segments now in this first hour will be about wisdom, life, and connection. And we want to emphasize those kinds of things. So let's begin with the idea of wisdom and highlight what we learn in the book of Proverbs, for instance, about wisdom. One of the keys, I think, that's important for education from a God-centered point of view is that we see wisdom from the book of Proverbs. In the book of Proverbs, there are 7 different words for wisdom, and they're different. They actually come out differently in the English. They're words like insight or understanding or knowledge, and all of these kinds of words have essentially the same idea, but they have just a little bit of a different color or hue to each one of them. And each one then focuses a different kind of light on education. What's really fascinating about that, when I think about it in terms of a metaphor, is that of a diamond. You have one truth, but as you look at it, the different facets of the diamond sparkle and they light up, and you see different ways of thinking about a biblical view of life and things. So when I think about the wisdom issue, we're talking not about an intellect or an IQ or an accumulation of knowledge in the gray matter. Wisdom is right conduct before God and other people. And that's really important for us to understand that we get this from a God-centered point of view, and that the source of education is something that comes supernaturally for us.
Well, I'm loving this, and today we're going to dive into education from a philosophical viewpoint, and we're also going to dive into it from a practical viewpoint.
That's right.
In our second hour, we are pleased to have Cindy Brumbarger from the Master's Study on, and she has a way of teaching homeschooling and intertwining faith-based and Christian-based principles. So you are listening to the Comenius Institute, Warp and Woof Radio. Dr. Mark Eckel, we're getting ready to come back, and we're getting ready to give some information here. So we've got a few songs. You guys stick and stay. Get your pens and papers out. We're going to go old school on them today, or your iPad, and join us for the Comenius Institute.
Let the church say.
RadioNext.tv. We are live on the Cool Groove site. The Comenius Institute, Warp and Woof Radio, is live right now. Dr. Mark Eckel is in the house, and today's theme is education. So I hope that you enjoyed today's program. We want to reiterate again, Warp and Woof. Let's give the tagline, Mark, on what Warp and Woof is, and I want to go right into it. I need to know, as a doctor and a professor, how do you define education?
Yeah. Education, boy, this goes way back again to my first days of teaching. I started teaching in junior and senior high school, and just about every single day, if not every class hour, I would say to my students, I don't want you to believe anything I teach you. I want you to go learn it for yourself. And this, of course, comes from Acts 17:11, that the Bereans were more noble than the Thessalonians because they went to see whether or not what Paul said was true. So I have a one-word definition for education, and that's just ownership. Now, my students would cry and wail and moan because I would make them write papers. And I was making them write because I wanted them to own what they believed. I didn't want this to be something they just parroted back to me from my words, but I wanted it to be their words from what they believed, from what they had studied. That was huge.
So education is way more than remembering answers, yes and no, multiple choice on a
Absolutely.
test.
Absolutely.
Going within oneself and discovering truth is what I'm listening to.
Well, we're actually taking ourselves and going out and learning and researching and studying and broadening our horizons. Absolutely.
Yeah. The question I like to ask, especially when we're talking about faith-based educational programming with the different fractions within a Christian community, for instance. How do we get the education streamlined with all the different variations of Christian faith?
Sure. There are lots of different perspectives on this. Actually, I contributed to a book. I brought it with me today. It's called Perspectives on Your Child's Education, 4 Views. And I contributed a chapter on Christian education, but there are others. Others believe that their kids should go to public. Some believe they should be homeschooled. Others believe they should be invested in a Christian environment, but with lots of non-believing friends. Any one of those is appropriate. But the point of the book, and of course the answer to the question, is that we have to teach young people how to think, not what to think. So we begin with a supernatural source, this wisdom source which comes out of the Scriptures, but then we give them all the tools that go along with that help them to think and develop these kinds of things. So I'll just run down a few of these tools. There are 5 of them that I've got. I think we should assimilate true truth. That means there has to be biblical instruction. We should discover truth. That means we demonstrate ownership through self-study. We discern truth from untruth, exposing non-Christian beliefs or beliefs that differ from ours. 4, we speak truth in love, which means we practice persuasion over confrontation. And then we apply truth in life, and we're trying to synthesize biblical principles throughout all of life.
Right. So traditional educational models, if we discussed this last week, have removed spirituality, God, faith-based programming from the school curriculum.
Right.
If we're going to define truth and then we remove value of truth,
that's right.
Could that be the fracture of what we have?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh,
my word. There's so many fractures everywhere in the universe, but education is the one we're talking about today. So as soon as you remove some kind of an absolute standard, then everybody is going to say, well, in essence, to their professors or teachers, why should I even listen to you? The only reason that some people go to school today, unfortunately, is because they just want the grade, they want the degree, they want the piece of paper, and they want to be able to walk out, and they're just blinded to everything that they've engaged within the school system or setting. And they've not really been taught how to think properly, not just as a Christian, but just as a human being. So we're not really taught how to discern. We're not taught how to understand other people. We're not taught how to get along or compare and contrast similarities and differences with what other people might believe. And so when you lose that absolute standard, then you're going to lose any kind of ability to evaluate or judge or see things from a different point of view, because there's no standard from which you're going to go.
And for the listener who might be just joining us, the Comenius Institute has a show each and every Wednesday, 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and the Comenius Institute has a belief system and a platform that allows young high school students specifically leaving home for the first time who have not had any faith-based Christian value training, and now for the first time they're out here in this big world and they have a place to go, a safe haven to go. 25 of these organizations come together across the country, target universities to make sure that our young people have a place to go to have some value training. Last question in this segment. Well, we got a couple, because I want to ask about the communication of God's truth in the Word, because we've got a spiritual dialogue, and we don't want to confuse church with school, because school is an education institution. But we also have to intertwine the value and the principles of God's teaching. So how do we do this, Mark?
Well, let's go back to something I heard you say earlier. In fact, I think it was off air where you were talking about that old line, "Sticks and stones might break your bones, but words will never hurt you," and how untrue that is. Absolutely. So when we talk about words, let's just think about the word, for instance. When you think about word, every word that we speak is loaded with our own point of view. It's loaded with our own interpretation. And beyond that, other people who are hearing our words are interpreting what we're saying. So what we're saying here through Warp and Woof and through Comenius is that there has to be a standard for how we think about words, and so we bring it from the Word of God. We understand there's a supernatural source of wisdom that comes from outside of us. So the beautiful weather we're experiencing today in Indianapolis is God's gift to us today, just as much as His Word is His gift to us, or the fact that He sent His Son to come to this earth and die on the cross and rise again from the dead. All of those things are great gifts of God, and they come through the Word. And so there has to be the Word that establishes words.
I like that. Sound like a poet over here.
Yeah.
And then the last question for this segment. With the institution being cracked, and we've discovered that the teaching institution has been cracked traditionally, who are the best educators now, and where should education happen now?
Yeah. Honestly, I think if you're going to ask me straight up, it's always going to be the home should be the primary focus. But I realize that some folks who might even be listening today going, you know what, I'm a single mom, I'm a single dad, or some young people are thinking, you know what, I really don't have anybody. Our responsibility begins in the home. But if there's nobody in the home, or if parents, single parents, or other folks need to look outside the home, then the church desperately needs to become invested and involved in the education of their young people. So we come alongside those young people. That's the reason for Comenius. We kind of help make that bridge between high school and college, make sure that young people have a relationship with somebody who actually cares for them, and those kinds of things are huge and important. But I would always begin with the home and the parents.
Yeah, and we know we have a cultural divide with that situation as well, and we have some students, specifically African-American community, is dealing with out the lack of mother, father, traditional household standards. How do we reach that community?
Oh, my. Well, we have all kinds of nonprofit groups and ministries around the city that are going to invest in the lives of young people. In fact, you might even want to promote one of yours here this morning, HB.
Don't get me started.
I know, man. Spin that your way. But the emphasis is always going to be relational. It can't be done digitally. It can't be done over an internet connection, though those are powerful tools. What we have to do is we literally have to walk with people. And if we learned anything from Jesus, it was that he walked with us. He came to be with us, and so we have to be with other people in order to make that happen.
And with that being said, the blanket doesn't work anymore. We have to individually go into pockets of people, find out, and start educating where they are. Because if we just try to roll out a one model pattern, we're going to lose a lot of people. We're going to come back, Doctor. And this is a great topic today. Education is the key as we continue to try to build our community back. You are listening to the Comenius Institute on Radio Next. RadioNext.TV on the Cool Groove site. You are listening to the Comenius Institute, Warp and Woof on your radio on the Cool Groove site here at RadioNext.TV. Dr. Mark Eckel, Harold H.B. Bell in the house. We also want to give a big shout out to Janelle Williams, one of our regular co-hosts here who cannot make it in today, but we know you're listening. We're having some great information exchange today. I guess before we start, Dr. Eckel, we need to, what is this, Random Act of Kindness Day?
That's right. There you go.
And we were just cracking up off the air about, wow, you mean you're going to just have to do random? Why can't we do like Random Act of Kindness life?
Yeah, isn't that the truth?
Just wake up, and some days just give the love where the love is needed, and it's random all the time.
Do good, do good, do good.
Yeah, and that's your tagline.
There you go.
But anyway, we're doing education today, talking education, especially how it is intertwined with Christian faith and beliefs. Programs that are available out here for our young people, alternative programs, as we know, traditional schooling, and that's not to knock it. I am a product of the Indianapolis Public School System and the Washington Township School System. Mark had great teachers, great education. Times have changed. That has really, really changed our educational platform. Yeah. I know Sunday you said there was an article in the paper.
Yeah.
And you're getting ready to share some of this information. But people, if you're listening and you're concerned, our educational system as we know it is in trouble. We have to provide some alternatives so we don't lose ground while the transition is being made. But there are changes that are going to be made. So, Mark?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. This last weekend, on Sunday, actually, front page, Indianapolis Star, title on the upside flap, Troubled Teachers. The subtitle is, Analysis Gives Indiana Failing Grades for Inadequately Screening Out Problematic Educators, Raising Questions About the State's Shortcomings. So when I read something like this, I want to say always and all the time, and this is something where the teachers need to sit up and cheer, I think teachers are the school. Teachers are the school. You don't go to a school because you've got a certain kind of principal or administrator. You can't jump from school to school in sports teams. What you do, however, have great math teachers, great history teachers. You have great English teachers. And those are the folks who are on the front lines with you day in and day out, and they're the ones who are going to make the big difference. And so we have to make sure, based on this Indy front page article, that we get really good teachers. And that really ought to be our focal point in all of schooling.
You know, I was fortunate to be married to a great educator, and I'm going to be honest, the passion that teachers, I would watch the group of teachers that she associated with.
Yep.
Man, there is a passion about teachers that you can't deny, but I'm watching the institution run some of those passionate teachers away.
Right.
How do we make sure, and like I say, we've got to catch it because we don't want to run people who are passionate about educating our children away. How do we
Yeah, so I gotta be straight up with everybody on this one. I think education's being taken away from the teachers today. We're getting top-down directives where we have to teach to a test, where we have to somehow make sure that our students can answer all kinds of true or false, fill-in-the-blank kinds of questions. And what teachers end up doing, because they're being evaluated on this basis, is they actually teach to the test. What we need to do is we need to give education back to the educators. We need to give education back to the teachers. So first step is you got to get the best teachers you can get into your schools. That's huge. And you got to take care of them financially and make sure that they're stable. But then you need to give them the freedom and the opportunity for imagination and discovery and going beyond. I don't talk about thinking outside the box. I just ask the question, what box? I've never seen the box. I don't know who built the box. I haven't seen anybody open the box. There is no box. Just let people that are teachers teach. So in the second hour, even this day, we're going to have Cindy Brumbarger here, and she's going to help us understand what her perspective on teaching is, something that truly answers the question, what box?
Exactly. And this goes back to when I asked you to define education earlier, and I never heard someone who went to college 4 years and went to school to get a teaching certificate.
Yeah.
I did not hear that.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing is we have to start teaching, and education begins at where we connect with the student.
It's always about relationship. So how we interact with people, where they're at. We always meet people where they're at. People are going to hear me say this all the time. This is what Jesus taught us. Jesus came out of heaven to earth. His incarnational emphasis, he was with us. And because he was with us, now we have the pattern, the example that we find. So we go forward with that, and we're with the people around us, creating these relationships. And whatever passionate area we're in, it doesn't matter what we're teaching.
And we can all be teachers if we just apply this one thought. Connected learning is the key. We talk about it all the time when we're using this discussion to talk about education. And connected learning simply means, if you're a listener, if a child has only been raised and knows eating cereal all day, then whatever you want to teach him, if you interject eating cereal to that conversation to try to get to another level of thought, another level of thinking, something they hadn't thought of before, use eating cereal. I'm dead serious, on a serious note, because you have to connect with what they know to start educating them. You can't just throw a whole new curriculum on them. They don't have anything to attach to it.
Right.
And then we want to teach. And I think that's what's happened in our educational system, because we used to do blanket education. We used to say a student is evaluated by being slow, highly intelligent, or whatever, maybe because they had a good memory.
Yeah, right. And that
doesn't apply.
It's just not applicable to every student. So, for instance, this summer I'm going to get some of my friends in here who are teachers who can't meet with us here on the Wednesday mornings, but they can during the summertime, and I'm going to have them in the studio here with us to talk about education from their point of view. So, for instance, I know Dave down at Heron High School, a great literature teacher. I can't wait to get him in here to talk about literature, and he's teaching downtown Indianapolis. We also have Joanna Taft. We want to make sure that Joanna gets in here so that she can talk about not only Heron High School, but also the Harrison Center for the Arts, emphasis on the art programming that we have all around us. But right now, I want to just tell you just this little bit of a story about my wife, Robin. Robin is this person who gets up every single morning at 5:30, and she's out the door at 6:15, and she's coming home at 6 at night. And what is she doing? She's being with these students all day long, and that's what she does, and that's what she's gifted to do and passionate to do. And we celebrate those teachers.
So you understand what I'm talking about.
Absolutely, you bet.
Really, and when you see that passion, it's contagious.
It absolutely
is.
It is
absolutely contagious. We know that we had the death of Judge Scalia recently, and you had some information that you wanted to convey before we go on this next break.
Sure.
Give me your sentiments about because this is going to be huge as we replace.
Yes, that's right.
Another Supreme Court judge. So
that's right. So I just wanted to mention that my comments about Judge Scalia are actually on the Warp and Woof website this morning. That's Warp and Woof, WARPANDWOOF.org. And I emphasize there that Scalia brought with him an awful lot of great teaching. So we're talking about education today. But his focus was always on words. What do words mean? Words have power. So we're talking about sticks and stones. All that stuff matters. So when we think about Scalia, I think about somebody who was dedicated to word, to meanings of words, and somebody who, by the way, HB, was really somebody who had a great sense of humor. In fact, he didn't care what you believed, what ethnicity you were from, what language you spoke, what nationality. He was a guy who loved telling jokes. And so here is this guy who brought people together through laughter, through levity. So what can we do to bring unity and consensus? And maybe that's one way we can do that.
Yeah, and that needs to be remembered. And when we come back, we want to definitely hit on a couple of more points because we have a great guest coming in today. We've been talking education, and alternative education is really what we're talking about because, not knocking the school systems, but tradition is dead right now. We have to find a way to save our babies. You're listening to the Comenius Institute, Warp and Woof Radio on RadioNext.tv and the Cool Groove site. RadioNext.tv on the Cool Groove site, the Comenius Institute, Warp and Woof Radio show. And Dr. Mark Eckel and I are in here. And today's topic is education and how do we intertwine that with Christian values, Christian beliefs. And to be quite honest, one without the other is a lack of education. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, second hour, we're going to be speaking with Cindy Brumbarger with the Master's Study. I don't know if you're available to have access to an internet right now. I would actually go online and go to the Master's Study and see a little bit about what they're doing. It's a great institution, more than a homeschool group. Hi, Cindy. How are you? This is live radio. Cindy just walked in, and we'll be talking to her in about 15 minutes, but we definitely want you to be aware of this great organization, this great school. I'm intrigued because I know that there's a different model out here. Mark, we were talking before the break about your beautiful wife, Robin,
yes,
being a second grade teacher.
That's right.
Being in institutional education. Without giving any negative connotations out here, what is her theory and her thinking about what's going on in our school system?
We share the same kind of theological, philosophical framework that all information begins with the fear of the Lord, and that really forms and frames our wisdom approaches. But we also believe that all students are made in God's image, and therefore each student is different from another. There's a uniqueness about each one of them, and so Robin involves herself and invests herself in each individual student, and she comes home and tells me stories about these young people and about the kinds of things they're interested in and the kinds of directions she's trying to help them to go in because of who they are, and that's really crucial. We've been at this, she and I, for over 50 years of our lives, committing ourselves to Christian education because we believe in that transcendent source of truth that comes out.
And I'd like to reiterate again to the listener who might be tuning in for the first time. You've been ministering since you were 13 years old.
That's right. Yeah,
so this is not something that Dr. Mark Eckel grew up and 40 years old said, I'm going to change, man. This is embedded in your spirit. This is part of who you are, which probably has something to do with your learning process as well.
That's
because I'm sure at 13 it was hard walking around talking about Jesus.
It was.
Yeah. Why is it so important to you? You said death prompts you to teach the next generation.
What does that even mean? I'll never forget the time I was. My pastor asked me to talk about education from the pulpit, and he said, "Mark, why do you teach?" And I said, "Well, because every day I think I wake up thinking about my death." And this horror-struck facial expression on his face, and all of the people kind of gasped, and I said, I want you to understand this is not a morbid thought. The point of death is that it prompts us to remember that I don't have one more day to live, I have one more day to give. And so that's what I always think about when I think about education. My responsibility really is to consider what eternity will bring, and beyond my own death, my responsibility for the next generation. So when I think about this, I'm always considerate of what the psalmist said in Psalm 78, until I'm old and gray, I will teach the next generation. We got some gray going on up in here. I love it.
I've got a little gray working myself, and I, it's unfortunate for me. I don't want to say unfortunate. I was designed to learn late to become a teacher. I was probably too brash and too arrogant in a younger age to even understand how serious transferring education and information is to our younger people. But now it is so passionate for me. I mean, I don't wake up a day without feeling like this is my mission. This is what I'm supposed to do.
Well, let me just intersect with that for a quick comment, because, frankly, I would tell my students, I would say to them, look, some of you are going to get it right now. Some of you are going to get it 10 years from now. Some of you are going to get it 20 years from now. You're going to turn around 20 years, you're going to wake up and you're going to say, Eckel was right all along. Now, it's not because I was telling them, it's because there was truth coming into their lives. So it doesn't matter when it is that you start, this process. Yeah. You start small, you start somewhere, but you start. That's the key.
And this leads to our next point. Janelle was in last week, and we were talking about those teaching moments.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. She's always teasing me about that.
And I guess as Christians, we need to definitely be engaged in understanding every time we step out, we're representing Christ some type of way.
Right.
And teaching moments are valuable, and we need to embrace them all times.
Yes, that's exactly right. So it doesn't matter what it is that we're teaching and where we are or with whom we are at. Actually, Robin and I had Janelle over last night. Shout out to Janelle here today. And we were talking about how we're going to intersect our educational endeavors with local churches. And that's what Janelle will always say about the teaching that she received. She will always say something like this: every moment was a teaching moment with you. And the idea is that it just kind of comes out of me. It doesn't matter who I'm with or where we are or what we're talking about. I always view this life as one where my contribution to somebody else is to perhaps think a different thought, think it from a different point of view, and always from a Christian vantage point.
Yeah, and you can't go wrong if you do that. I'm just interested and intrigued about talking about the master study, which we'll be talking about next, because I saw something there that it just intrigued me so much: student placement instead of what grade they're in.
Yeah, okay.
That is getting to the level of now
right.
teaching individuals instead of a classroom per se. I don't think that you should limit a 12-year-old if they're thinking on a level of being a designer or being
absolutely
a musician or whatever, and then you're a sixth grader.
Yeah, that's right.
How stunning is that?
Yeah,
in the educational process.
We regiment people into these compartments, and so we place them in schoolrooms in a way that doesn't really necessarily identify with where they're at. I mean, they might need a little bit of remediation, or they might be able to, jump ahead in whatever grade level or whatever subject area that we're talking about, because they've been given this gift.
Yeah, and one of the other things I want to talk about, social skills.
Yeah.
We need to talk about the social skills.
Sure.
When we do homeschooling, how much is that compromised maybe in the big picture?
Right. Honestly, actually, I believe that homeschooling is one of the greatest social components and has some of the greatest social components in education. And again, this goes back to something I said earlier in the hour, and that is the relationship. Honestly, the relationship that I have with homeschool students is unlike any other relationship. And I've taught Christian students for over 30 years now. And what I find in them, and I still find, even those students who have gone into college now, and I'm with them on a weekly basis with Comenius, I find over and over and over again that they're interesting people, but they're interested in what you have to say. They're really fascinated by a different approach to life and learning. They've grown up in a certain kind of environment, but they've grown up with all kinds of friends around them and all kinds of adults that make a huge difference in their lives. And so they're always being invested in one way or another, and that's really crucial.
Well, that was a segue moment.
Of course it was.
Because we're getting ready to introduce you to Cindy Brumbarger with the master's study. And what I love about the master's study is, words, you said
that's
words
right.
are powerful.
Words are powerful.
The apostrophe on that S means we're talking about the big fella.
Yeah.
We're going to come right back. We're going to introduce you to the Master of Studies, Cindy Brumbarger. This is the Comenius Institute radio show on RadioNext.tv and the Cool Groove site. RadioNext.tv on the Cool Groove site. We are back, and you are listening to the Comenius Institute Warp and Woof Radio show. Dr. Mark Eckel is bringing some very valuable information about education on the show today. And before we introduce you to our guest, Mark, we just want to, ask you and get another philosophy, some more philosophy about your educational practices.
Yep, absolutely.
Because it's going to be very important that they understand this and why we have our guest in today.
Yeah, exactly. So this kind of teaching that I'm talking about this morning really goes right into what homeschooling does. So let me tell you a couple stories about a couple of students. I've been teaching in the past here with the master's study, a course on Gothic horror literature. And so we've been talking in the first hour about how we need to meet students where they're at, see their individual gifts and so on. So I'm teaching this Gothic horror lit class, Dracula, Frankenstein, Jekyll, Hyde, those kinds of things. But then at the end, they all develop their own projects. Well, one young woman is committed to music, and so her project was she literally wrote 2 brand new musical scores for horror films. She was so interested in the music that goes into horror films that she wrote 2 original scores. She played them for us. This was her project. She talked about that. I had another young woman who's an artist, and she abridged Dracula, and she took the abridgment and then put in 10 of her own hand drawings of various scenes within Dracula itself. And she actually came to my house. There was a knock on my door in December, and she handed me the hardcover copy of this thing. She had it published. So the student projects are really huge to me. So all of that comes out of my philosophy of teaching. My philosophy of teaching is that teaching must be content-centered. You've got to have something to talk about, some kind of content you're interested in. It's got to be teacher-directed. Somebody's going to have to help you through the process of directing you in a certain direction. And then ultimately, it's student-discovered. So we want students to engage in this based on the things that they're learning through the teacher's help and instruction, but then get them invested in their education.
And you mentioned this, and this is opening my eye, and I'm sure this is what the master's study is centered around, the sense of accomplishing something.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
That you're good at.
That's right. A passion that's developed.
It's so important in the educational process because if you feel that sense of accomplishment, it's going to make you want to go back and build on more.
That's right.
And I think that's what education is. How did you meet our guest today? As we mentioned, Cindy Brumbarger is
Sure.
The master's study.
Yeah.
How did you meet her?
Honestly, I think, Cindy, you ought to just tell this story because this story goes back to my office, and you came in and we talked for 45 minutes. Do you remember that?
I remember it very, very well. So there was a phone call initiated by Mark. He had become familiar with the master study and what we do, and got together to talk about opportunities for a dual credit partnership at that point in the game, and visited with him in his office, started talking about educational philosophies, the mission of our organization, the outcomes that we are really looking for in education that differ from your traditional empirical measurement of success. Very, very, very different in that regard, and became almost instant kindred spirits in recognizing that really education is more than simply outcomes. It is about a person. It's not about a pedigree. It's not about a product. It's about the individual as a whole. And so often we tend to look at education and the outcomes within a student as completeness and as accomplishing a set of check marks, where really that outcome needs to be about the development of the whole student and creating a lifelong learner. It's not what they study. It's the studies that enable them to learn anything that they step into later in life.
And when I was reading a little bit about the master's study, one of the things that I noticed is you're just committed to critical thinking skills
Absolutely.
Of our students. And Mark and I was talking about that earlier today, how the lack of critical thinking skills get a lot of our children in trouble, just not knowing how to respond in the middle of an adult trying to correct you or police pulling you over or whatever. If you don't have critical thinking skills, then you're going to make a decision that's just based off of one level of thinking, and that's usually going to be fear or anger.
And this goes back actually to the Christian emphasis for us it's for us, it's Christian critical thinking. So we're really invested in how do we understand God's wisdom that's come to us through His Word, through His creation, and then how do we invest ourselves in that.
Right, and today so many people think of critical thinking as being math and science outcomes, that it's all about logic and engineering. Critical thinking has roots in the character itself, and that's not something that you always see taught throughout the different topics that are studied within a school setting, whether it's a home school, a private school, or a public school. It really doesn't matter. That critical thinking skill of thinking 3 steps ahead, of understanding how we got to the place where we are at this moment in time, and then recognizing that your response has impact and influence, whether it is with a police officer who just pulled you over, or your response to a professor, your response to someone in a Starbucks, your response to a novel that you just read, your response to scripture that was just placed on your heart.
So concentrating on every aspect at every moment. Before we take a break, we would love for you to introduce yourself and then tell us how you got involved with education, and we want to come back and find as much about the Master Study as we can.
So my role at the Master Study is program direction. I'm a program director. My job is to create a program that equips and enables our homeschooling families who participate. My journey to get here is completely non-traditional. I'm, believe it or not, a nurse by trade. Started homeschooling my students because I felt we were spending a lot in resources, time, energy, effort, money for private education, and felt there had to be something different out there. And just discovered a passion for teaching differently, for teaching with alternative methods that are actually more traditional than not. And one thing led to another, and I've been in this role for 7 years now. I've graduated one. I'm about to graduate my last, and it has been an absolute blessing for me.
And you say you graduated one and getting ready to graduate the other?
Absolutely.
Awesome. What we want to do is we want to take a break, and then when we come back, we want to find out about the Master Study. This is an incredible program, great alternative for people seeking and wishing that they had another educational route. You are listening to the Comenius Institute radio show on RadioNext. RadioNext.tv on the Cool Groove site, and that is over in AWD and cloudy. I don't know why I felt that way with all the students in the house. And we want to welcome our special guest today. Mark, I'm going to let you, kind of take this over because Cindy Brumbarger has the Master Study, the educational developer over there and curriculum developer. And this is fascinating because what we're trying to do is just create an avenue and information for our listeners to have some alternatives. This isn't to try to flip your world around, but if you don't have this information and this alternative, I think you'd be missing. So, Mark, please introduce our guest.
Absolutely. So, Cindy Brumbarger is one of the great leaders at the Master Study, and we're just thrilled that you could be with us today. Thank you ever so much for being here. We've been friends for a number of years now, and really thankful to be engaged not just with you in the Master Study, but also with your family. Shout out to Tanner when he hears this podcast, so his name has been mentioned. There you go. It's all yours now. Tell us about the Master Study.
Okay, so the Master Study is really a hybrid, if you will, when it comes to educational models. So most people will look at the Master Study on the surface and assume that it's a homeschool co-op, because that model is what most associate with the homeschool movement. Homeschooling co-ops typically gather individuals together and they share the workload, they share the objectives amongst the parents who are homeschooling their students. What our model does is we step in as an organization, the Master Study, and we advocate for those parents and create a framework for them to execute their homeschooling at home during the week while giving them a 1 or 2 day experience in a typical classroom setting. So we retain teachers, we develop a scope and sequencing, we vet the curriculum that is used, and basically give our families a trajectory on which to continue home educating at home. It is very typical of what most traditional school systems are referring to now as an inverted classroom. That's a buzzword that you're seeing talked about more and more in public and private circles, where the bulk of the education happens at home. So the reading, answering the questions, that rote memorization, the grunt work that everybody kind of yawns and groans over. And then they come to our location either once a week if they're 8th grade and younger, twice a week if they're high school students. And the role of the Master Study on those days is to become the mortar to hold the bricks together. So we want to help students connect ideas, give them opportunity for Socratic discussion, really figure out where they're struggling and bring them along, expand their thoughts, give them opportunities to be with other students, and to engage in ways that are really difficult to do in the home.
So talk a little bit about the teachers that you've invested in at the Master's Study and why the teachers that you're retaining are so important.
Our teachers are everything, absolutely everything. I've been incredibly blessed as a program director to have a significant retention rate among my teachers. They're vested. Many of these teachers actually have a public or private school teaching background. They know what it's like to be part of a 5-day-a-week program. They're passionate about teaching. They're not ready to continue in that form, so they come to us. What's freeing for me is that I have the ability to hire people who are passionate. It doesn't have anything to do with their credentialing as much as it is who they are as an individual. Are they passionate about the topic? They have to be knowledgeable, obviously, but a passionate teacher can create passionate students. They want to learn. And so having that passion is actually the number one attribute I look for in a teacher. Then we start talking about their skill set. And then, oh, by the way, what is your degree again? That's always way down the line for me when I'm vetting teachers.
Yeah. When you talk about your teachers and the need that you have for them and that teachers are everything, talk a little bit about the necessity of those folks being believers in Jesus.
To not be a believer would immediately discount a staff member, because our foundation is Him. Our foundation is truth, and truth is the destination. So one of the hallmarks of a classically minded education is to train students to pursue. We want them to be in pursuit of truth. In our community, truth is always capitalized. Mm-hmm. And that's a very different idea for some people who don't know there is a difference. It may mean that we're using something very traditional, like math or science or even a logic class. But if a student is trained over time to understand the need to pursue truth, he or she will eventually realize there is only one source of truth. That is our teaching philosophy. So if you have an individual teaching in the classroom who doesn't understand that, who doesn't subscribe to that, then our goals and objectives won't be met for the student at all.
Sure. So when you're talking about the issue of truth, I always think about what Francis Schaeffer said as true truth. There are lots and lots of truths out there, lots of different approaches and methodologies to education, but more importantly, there are different philosophies of education. So tell us about how the true truth comes through in the Master's Study. That is, how does the truth of transcendence from heaven, from God's Word, from His creation, come through into the small t truth, into all of the areas and arenas that you're invested in at Master's?
That's a really great question and idea to discuss, because it's very much non-traditional in that most of the time education is segmented into pieces. That's just the way that we as a society function. It's not a dig, it's just different. When it comes to classical education, which has a heavy emphasis on humanities, I liken it to an amazing novel. So if you read just a book, you have characters and a basic plot, and that's pretty much the end of it. That's entertainment. That's all it is. You're entertained by the story. There's a couple of characters that make the story. There's a setting that gives you kind of an idea of what's unfolding, and that's where it ends. But it is the novel that you go back and read over and over and over again, because each time you read it, you see a different influence, you see a different character trait, you see a different idea. The character in your mind changes each time you read it differently. Humanities education takes that same approach, where your students are asked to pull from all those different avenues: the character, the influence on the character, the setting, how the setting impacts it, the worldview, and then, of course, the deity of the master and his plan and the role for the reader, if you will, who's reading that story. What is that role that has to be present in every conversation in one form or another? And it may not be boldly present, but that underlying tone of the influence, or in some cases, the lack of permitted influence in an individual who shuns truth, and what the outcome is.
That's so great.
We're getting ready to end this segment, but this is some powerful information, because the educator is being educated right now. I'm just noticing the social impact that when you were saying they come on campus 2 times a week, and I was thinking how impactful this must be when they're learning, not only having to deal with the outside influences of the world, but they can really focus on Christ. And then when they get a chance to come, the energy has to be incredible, like less is more.
Yes.
So you get 2 times a week to come and engage and do this. I'm sure that's powerful for the students. We're going to take a break. This is powerful, Cindy. We're talking about the master study, Dr. Mark Eckel. We will be right back. 1 song. We're not doing 2. We want you to get all of this information. This is the Comenius Institute, Warp and Woof Radio. RadioNext.tv on the Cool Groove site. We are back at Comenius Institute. Just want to give big shouts out to my brother who came in, Landon Turner, former IU legend, great. And we're working to do some programming together. But we just want to recognize our special guest today, Miss Cindy Brumbarger with the Master Study. Man, you are doing it, and your information is so concise. It's like a scalpel, Mark. I mean, really, she's slicing, telling us about what's going on at the Master Study. And I'm sure I'm getting pops on my phone inbox. And
that's good.
That's a beautiful thing when they want to know more about it. So, as I told you before, you can go out and look up the Master Study. .org, and you can find out everything. I went online this morning, and I'm a believer. So, Mark, continue, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, my friends are who make me what I am. So it's only the brilliance of the people sitting next to me that's.
Be careful, friends.
Well, you had ended in our last segment here talking about humanities-based curriculum. Tell us a little bit about why that's such an important foundation for young people.
Well, in the last segment, I alluded to the idea of a novel, and that really does sum up what humanities education is all about. Instead of having pieces of dessert, it's one big layer cake where each layer builds upon the other. So the model that the Master Study approaches and adopts when it comes to the study of humanities is we let the historical period of study drive what we do. So that historical period that we're studying drives the literature that our students study. It drives the pieces that we talk about, the pieces that the student memorizes, the discussions that we have, they're all centered around that one component, because history is simply history. It's geopolitical ideas, it's some influence of economics and geography, but it doesn't always incorporate the richness of man, the influence of the individuals, the influence of their characters, the movements, the philosophical movements that influence that story of mankind unfolding. So we try to bring that all together and teach it to our students as one great big story.
Let's kind of hit on this issue of history, because this is something that's near and dear to my heart. When we talk about history, we have this tendency to think, at least some young people do, they think that history started when they were born.
Yes, they do.
You get that sense from some young people. So we get this idea that history starts when I'm here, and we forget all of this other stuff that came before us. So tell us a little bit about why history is so important to learn for young people.
I think certainly at the older levels, at the younger levels with children, it really is a story. They're just learning the story and the characters, and they're not quite at a point where they can have those deeper conversations. That happens 7th and 8th grade, 9th grade. We start having those deeper conversations certainly by high school. But the reality of it is history is a vehicle that allows us to teach our students how to look at circumstances in our time, in their time, and then draw those inferences from what we can learn based on what they would have seen then and what we see now. So I think probably honestly, the strongest example that I have of that is the issue of slavery when you talk about it in American history. And it's so easy for our students to look back on it, as it is for all of us, and say that was offensive and it was wrong and why did they do that? But taking the students all the way back and planting them in the year and say, here's why they thought that. And if you were there, what would you have done? To get them to think critically in that regard, my hope is that when we move on, and 100 years from now, people look back at us as a society and say, why did they think that way? Why on earth did they act that way? It develops some real critical thinking skills for our students.
So let's think just for a moment about the issue, the connecting history to application, because this is, you hit on something here that's just hugely important. Basically, what you're suggesting by this philosophy is, in educational philosophy, it's called perennialism, which means that there are basic concepts and ideas that continue to be repeated throughout human history because they're really powerful and important ideas. So Give us an example or two beyond what you have already done about the application of history or literature, and show maybe how your students have been impacted in their own lives or in the life of this culture by their application of the things that you're learning there.
I think probably the best application there is what happens with our sophomores in high school. So our sophomores are studying the modern period of history, which basically picks up after Reconstruction, and we take them all the way to the present. You have a lot of major social events that are happening during that time period. When you've got the Reconstruction era, but you've got women's rights that are coming in there. You go through the Roaring '20s into the Depression of the '30s, the issues surrounding World War II and the atrocities in Europe, then the Civil Rights era, all of that. And the literature that we choose mimics each period. So they read that and find that parallel. But what's hallmark about that for us is when we get to the very end of that study, the novel that we actually give our students to read is The Hunger Games. There is nothing about The Hunger Games that is amazing literature. Let's make that very clear. It's entertainment. But the beauty of The Hunger Games is the students are reading a work that is very contemporary, that all of their friends have read, that the local, conversation in Starbucks, they know The Hunger Games. And our students come away with that, reading that piece of literature, if you will, that's a broad statement, saying this was shallow. It was absolutely shallow, and they can actually see the progression of man's thoughts, that postmodernistic view, and the influence that it has on all the historical movements. That's very, very powerful.
Mark, this goes back to what we were speaking of, Cindy, on the first hour, and we talk about connected learning. And I think too many times when we teach history, there's nothing for the young people to connect to that's going to make them even want to digest it.
Yeah.
And the tool that you're using is great, because you have to have something current that's going to make them even be able to say this is different, although it's connected.
And I think that's really true when you're paralleling the literature with the history, because one feeds the other. It's almost cyclical. So if you look at F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, you're talking about what's happening in the 1920s in the United States and globally, really, when it comes to the culture, the reflection of The Great Gatsby, the personality of Fitzgerald himself gives a holistic picture of the decade. So when you take that and you vault it forward to present day, and you've got this novel, which is a great novel to be talking about in context, it tells the students something about where they are at the present moment in time.
It's all about the student. We're going to take another short break before we wind the show down today. The Comenius Institute, Warp and Woof Radio, here at RadioNext.tv on the Cool Groove site. RadioNext.tv on the Cool Groove site. This is just wonderful in here. Anytime you can spark the brain and have it move is what we want to do each and every Wednesday morning, 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the Comenius Institute. We call it Warp and Woof Radio. Dr. Mark Eckel, tell them again about Warp and Woof so they can know. They won't be confused by this.
Sure. Warp and Woof is the vertical and horizontal threads that make up fabric. So everything you're wearing right now is warped and woofed. And in that sense of things, that's how I came to understand the basis for my website. All things are held together by Christ, Colossians 1:17. And so we find this cohesiveness in the world because of that.